My name is Nora Whitmore. I'm 38 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've been the daughter who handled things quietly. On paper, I'm a corporate compliance consultant based in Boston. I spend my days reviewing contracts, identifying risk, and making sure powerful people don't cut corners they'll later regret. It's meticulous work, invisible work, the kind of work that only gets noticed when something goes wrong. In my family, I played a similar role. I was the steady one, the reasonable one, the daughter who didn't compete for attention because she didn't need it, or so everyone believed. My older brother Daniel was the charismatic heir apparent to our father's business empire. He was bold, charming, and decisive. People described him as natural leadership material. I was described as supportive. What most people never realize is that when you spend years being underestimated, you develop a different kind of strength. You listen longer, you document more carefully, you learn how systems really work, not just how they look from the outside. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about dramatic confrontations or public humiliation. It's about something quieter, slower, more deliberate. It began with a single decision my brother made while I was overseas on a 6-week consulting assignment. A decision that changed the legal status of our father. A decision that almost handed him total control over a multi-generational empire. My brother bribed a doctor to declare our father mentally unfit, so he could seize power of attorney before I returned. Control over my father meant control over the empire. When I first heard what had happened, I didn't scream. I didn't rush home in a storm of outrage. I did what I've always done. I asked questions. What you'll hear over the next hour isn't a story about explosive justice. It's about psychological reversal. At the moment, silence stops being submission and becomes a strategy. About what happens when someone mistakes composure for weakness and discovers too late that it was calculation. There were no dramatic speeches, no scenes worthy of a courtroom drama, just paperwork, timelines, and one irreversible decision. If you've ever been underestimated in your own family, if you've ever watched someone mistake your calm for incapacity, have you ever wondered what would happen if you stopped correcting them? In my family, identity was assigned early. Daniel was the future. I was the dependable one. There's a difference. Daniel was 3 years older than me, and from the time he could string together a confident sentence, our father began introducing him to executives as the next generation. I was introduced as my daughter, Nora. She's very bright. It sounds generous. It sounds affectionate. But it was a soft ceiling. Brightness is admired. Leadership is expected. At family gatherings, Daniel would stand beside my father, absorbing stories about expansion deals and hostile takeovers. I was usually seated near my mother, refilling glasses, smoothing over awkward pauses, remembering who disliked whom and why. I noticed dynamics. I learned who held quiet influence in the room. No one asked what I was learning. When I left for university, I chose regulatory law and corporate governance. Not because it sounded glamorous, because I'd grown up watching how fragile power actually was. Empires don't fall because of dramatic betrayals. They fall because someone overlooked a clause, misfiled a document, trusted the wrong signature. Daniel studied business management, then returned to join our father's company in a visible role, strategy, expansion, and public-facing initiatives. He appeared in trade magazines. He shook hands. He smiled for photographs. I built a career elsewhere. People assumed that meant I wasn't interested in the family empire. That assumption suited everyone. It meant Daniel didn't have to compete with me. It meant my father didn't have to reconsider the narrative he'd constructed for decades. At board dinners, when I attended as a guest, I was complimented on being so grounded. One executive once told me, in what he likely thought was praise, "It's good you're not caught up in the power game like your brother." I smiled. What he didn't know was that compliance is the skeleton of power. It's the part you don't see until it fractures. Growing up, invisibility becomes a skill. You learn how to exist without demanding space. You learn to read micro-expressions across a table. You remember dates, exact wording, offhand comments. Daniel never noticed that I listened more than I spoke. He didn't notice that when our father vented about board tensions, I asked precise questions, not emotional ones. He didn't notice that I knew which subsidiaries were structured loosely, which trust documents hadn't been updated in years, and which directors were aging without clear succession plans. He saw me as external, adjacent, harmless. And to be fair, I allowed that perception to stand. There's a kind of safety in being underestimated. No one prepares for you. No one hides things carefully. But invisibility has a cost. At holidays, when Daniel and my father debated expansion strategies, I would offer a measured concern, usually about regulatory exposure. Daniel would laugh lightly and say, "That's why you're in compliance, Nora. Always worst-case scenario." Everyone would chuckle. I would let it go. Not because I lacked conviction, but because challenging him publicly would have shifted the room into something ugly. I valued stability more than validation. Still, I remember the tone. The way people speak when they've already decided on your role. Reliable, useful, not central. Over time, that narrative hardens. Even you begin to question whether stepping forward would disrupt something you're meant to protect. So I stayed in my lane, built my own reputation, my own income, my own quiet authority in a different arena. To them, I was the daughter who chose independence over inheritance. What they didn't understand was that independence can be strategic, and distance can be temporary. You can stand outside an empire and still know exactly how it's built. The first cut didn't look like a betrayal. It looked like paperwork. I was in London when it happened, 5 hours ahead of Boston, buried in a cross-border compliance audit that required my full attention. My father and I had spoken 2 nights before. He sounded tired but lucid, irritated about a supplier dispute, curious about my travel schedule, entirely himself. 48 hours later, I received a short email from Daniel. Subject line, update on Dad. No urgency in the wording, no phone call. Inside, he wrote that our father had been evaluated after a minor episode of confusion during a board briefing. A physician had determined there were early cognitive concerns. As a precaution, Daniel had initiated a temporary power of attorney to ensure continuity of leadership. Temporary. Precaution. Continuity. Every word was technically reasonable. That's what made it dangerous. I read the email twice, then a third time. The phrasing felt curated, clean, as if written by someone who understood how records age. I called Daniel immediately. He didn't answer. Instead, he sent a text. In meetings all afternoon, "Don't worry, I've got this handled. Don't worry, I've got this handled." It was the first time I realized something had shifted, not in the facts, but in the posture. Daniel had always been ambitious, but he wasn't reckless. He liked approval too much. He liked being seen as competent, not controversial. So if he had moved this quickly, medical evaluation, legal documentation, board notification, then the groundwork had likely been laid before that minor episode. You don't secure power of attorney overnight in a billion-dollar corporation without preparation. I called our father. No answer. I tried again an hour later. Voicemail. By the time I reached him the following morning, his tone was off. Not confused, not disoriented, just guarded. "Oh, sweetheart," he said gently. "Daniel's just helping me with some administrative burdens. The doctor thought it would reduce stress." Which doctor? He couldn't remember the name. That was the first detail I wrote down, not because I assumed corruption, but because something in my body registered the imbalance, the speed, the containment of information. Later that day, one of the board members, an older man who had known me since childhood, sent a brief message. "Your brother is stepping up impressively. Your father's in good hands." The phrasing again, stepping up, as if there had been a vacancy. I felt the first small cut then. Not rage, not panic. Exclusion. No one had thought to consult me. Not because I lacked legal literacy, not because I was unreachable, but because I wasn't considered central to the power structure. Daniel hadn't argued with me. He hadn't dismissed me openly. He had simply moved without me, and the room had adjusted around him. From London, 5 time zones away, I understood something quietly devastating. If the narrative became that our father was mentally unfit, even temporarily, control would default to whoever held legal authority. And legal authority shapes reality faster than truth does. Still, I didn't accuse him. I didn't escalate. I sent one measured email. "Please forward me the evaluation report and documentation of the power of attorney for review. As a family member, I'd like clarity." His response came hours later. "Let's discuss when you're back. No need to complicate things remotely. No need to complicate things." That was the moment I stopped being simply concerned and started paying attention. When something feels wrong but no one else reacts, you begin by questioning yourself. That's how normalization begins. I flew back to Boston a week earlier than planned. Not dramatically, I didn't announce my return. I simply rescheduled meetings and boarded a plane. At the office headquarters, the atmosphere felt almost celebratory. Subtle but unmistakable. Daniel's photo had been updated on the internal leadership page. Same title, but with an added line. Acting Executive Authority. Temporary language. Permanent positioning. Employees greeted me warmly, but with a certain softness. the way you speak to someone who is peripheral to the current shift. I'm sure it's hard being away during all this, one senior manager told me. All what? When I asked to see the medical evaluation, Daniel's assistant informed me it was confidential. I would need written authorization. From whom? From Daniel. I remember standing in that hallway, absorbing the precision of the barrier. Not an argument, not hostility, procedure. Daniel met me that evening at our father's home. He looked composed, slightly tired, convincing. You're overthinking this, he said gently. Dad had a disorientation episode during a financial review. Couldn't recall a recent acquisition timeline. The board panicked. I stepped in. Which physician conducted the assessment? I asked. A specialist, he replied. Name? He hesitated, just a fraction of a second before providing it. I recognized it immediately, not because the name was famous, because it was associated with expedited executive evaluations. Private, discreet, rarely questioned. Was I listed as an emergency contact? I asked. That wasn't necessary, Daniel said, voice still calm. You were overseas. There it was again, logically defensible, emotionally diminishing. Over the next few days, small patterns emerged. Board communications referenced Daniel as the stabilizing force. Our father was encouraged, politely, to rest more, to reduce direct involvement in complex negotiations. The narrative formed quickly. Concerned son, aging patriarch, responsible transition. I watched as people adjusted their language around me. They assumed I would support Daniel, that I would be grateful someone had handled it. At a private dinner with 2 board members, one leaned in and said, "It's wise not to challenge this publicly. Markets react poorly to perceived family discord." I hadn't challenged anything, but the possibility had already been neutralized. This is how disrespect becomes normalized. Not through shouting, through soft containment, through well-intentioned advice that subtly defines your boundaries. I could have confronted Daniel outright, accused him, demanded a forensic review, but an accusation without evidence is noise, and noise would confirm their assumptions about me, emotional, reactive, destabilizing. So I did what I'd been trained to do professionally. I observed. I reviewed the power of attorney documentation once I secured a copy through a formal request. It had been executed 3 days before the supposed episode at the board meeting. 3 days. I didn't mention it immediately. Instead, I asked Daniel casually over coffee. When exactly did Dad's confusion occur? Tuesday morning, he said. The document was dated the prior Saturday. I nodded as if satisfied. He mistook that nod for compliance. That's the thing about repeated dismissal. You start to internalize the silence. You convince yourself that maintaining peace is maturity. Those challenging inconsistencies are a necessary friction, but each small contradiction lodged somewhere deeper. I began keeping a separate folder, digital and physical, dates, statements, board minutes, medical notes, not because I was ready to act, but because normalization only works when someone stops remembering the original version of events. I was not going to forget. It took about 2 weeks for the new dynamic to settle into something almost comfortable. That's the unsettling part. Nothing dramatic happened. No announcements. No formal declarations that Daniel had assumed control. Just small, consistent shifts in behavior. Board agendas were sent to him first. Vendors copied him on sensitive emails. Our father's calendar began filling with rest days, and I was gently, subtly repositioned. At one strategy session I attended, Daniel opened the meeting by thanking everyone for their patience during this transitional period. He glanced at me briefly, not dismissively, not warmly, just acknowledging my presence as family, not as a stakeholder. When a regulatory question arose about a pending acquisition in Singapore, all eyes instinctively turned to me. I answered thoroughly, outlining potential exposure risks and compliance timing. There was a brief silence. Then Daniel smiled and said, "That's exactly why Nora's invaluable. She keeps us safe." Valuable, safe, peripheral. The room relaxed. The hierarchy is restored. I wasn't a threat. I was an asset. After the meeting, one of the younger executives approached me privately. "It must be strange watching the shift," she said carefully. "What shift?" I asked. She hesitated. "Well, succession. It feels more formal now." Succession. The word had never been spoken explicitly in front of me before. I drove home that evening, understanding something I should have acknowledged years earlier. A role had been assigned to me long ago, and I had unconsciously honored it. Reliable, useful, invisible. I was the stabilizer. The one who made sure crises didn't erupt. The one who smoothed tensions between Daniel and our father when their tempers clashed. The one who remembered anniversaries, called board members' spouses when someone was ill, ensured no social thread unraveled. Emotional labor masquerading as loyalty. And because I did it well, I was never considered central to authority. Daniel didn't need to belittle me. The structure already did that for him. At dinner one night, our father said casually, "I'm grateful Daniel's taken on more weight. It's time." I looked at him carefully. Time for what? He paused. To prepare, just in case. Just in case. I noticed something then, not confusion in him, but influence around him. His phrasing echoed Daniel's language almost perfectly. The narrative had been rehearsed. Still, I didn't argue, because arguing would confirm the frame, emotional daughter resisting necessary change. Instead, I asked, "Are you comfortable with the current arrangement?" He nodded, too quickly. Yes, less pressure. Less pressure can feel like relief, even when it's removal. That night, I went home and sat at my kitchen table with my black leather portfolio open in front of me. Documents neatly tabbed. Dates aligned. Small inconsistencies are mapped quietly in the margins. I realized the role they expected me to play in the coming months. Supportive sister, reasonable daughter, non-disruptive presence. Someone who would endorse the transition publicly, smoothing any market concern. They expected compliance. They forgot I specialize in it. And compliance is never about obedience. Never about obedience. It's about structure. That was the night I stopped asking whether I was overreacting and started asking a different question. If this was the role they assigned me, what role had Daniel assigned himself? The shift didn't happen in a boardroom. It happened in a hospital corridor. 3 weeks after I returned to Boston, our father experienced what Daniel described as another mild episode. This time, he insisted on taking him to a private neurological clinic outside the city. Discreet, efficient, reputation managed. Daniel called me after the appointment was already underway. "You don't need to rush," he said. "It's routine." I went anyway. The clinic was quiet in that polished, expensive way, designed to make serious things feel controlled. Neutral walls, soft lighting, no visible chaos. When I arrived, Daniel was speaking with a physician near the reception desk. Their conversation ended the moment I stepped closer. "Everything's fine," Daniel said smoothly. "They're recommending observation." I looked at the doctor directly. "May I see the evaluation notes?" There was the slightest flicker in his expression. Not guilt, not fear. Calculation. "I'll need authorization from the acting legal representative," he replied. Acting legal representative. Daniel didn't say a word. We sat together in the waiting area afterward. He scrolled through his phone, occasionally responding to messages from the office. I watched the rhythm of it, the comfort of control. After an hour, a nurse invited me back to see my father briefly. He was sitting upright, alert. Tired, yes, but not confused, not incoherent. "Nora," he said with a faint smile, "Daniel's being overly cautious." I pulled a chair closer. "Do you feel overly cautious?" I asked gently. He sighed. "I feel managed." It was the first honest word he'd offered. Managed, not protected, not supported. Managed. Before I could ask more, the nurse re-entered, reminding us that visiting time was limited. As I stood to leave, I noticed something small on the bedside table. A clipboard with consent forms. I didn't touch it. I simply read the header. Capacity Assessment Authorization. The signature line was filled in. The date was 2 days prior to his first so-called episode. 2 days. I felt something settle inside me then, not anger, not fear. Clarity. You don't pre-authorize a capacity reassessment unless you're anticipating a result. Back in the corridor, Daniel was speaking quietly on the phone. "Yes, once it's formalized, we can accelerate restructuring." Restructuring. I didn't confront him, I didn't interrupt. Instead, I walked to the end of the hallway where a framed photograph hung. A landscape of the Boston skyline at dusk. Calm, controlled, balanced. And I understood something with unsettling calmness. This wasn't panic-driven overprotection. This was positioning. Daniel wasn't reacting to our father's decline. He was manufacturing the timeline of it. And the brilliance of it was procedural. Medical assessments, legal instruments, board reassurance. Nothing loud, nothing illegal on the surface. Just acceleration. In that corridor, I felt the final piece of self-doubt dissolve. Not because I had undeniable proof of bribery yet, but because the pattern was too precise. Daniel had always been impatient with waiting for legacy. He wanted certainty. Power of attorney provided that certainty. Control over my father meant control over the empire, and control over the empire meant the narrative could be rewritten in real time. I could have confronted him that afternoon, accused him directly, demanded transparency, but something inside me resisted the impulse, because if he were this prepared, confrontation would only push him to fortify faster. Instead, I did something smaller. I went home, and I drafted a list, not of accusations, of leverage. That was the day something shifted, not in him, in me. I stopped reacting to what was happening. and started mapping what would happen next. People often mistake silence for surrender. They assume that if you're not protesting, you're agreeing. If you're not confronting, you're conceding. Daniel made that mistake. After the hospital visit, I stopped asking direct questions. I didn't request additional documentation. I didn't challenge the board's language. I even attended 2 executive dinners and publicly praised Daniel's stability during transition. The relief in the room was almost visible. Markets don't fear succession, they fear uncertainty. And I was no longer a source of uncertainty. Daniel began looping me in selectively, carefully curated updates, financial summaries, and board notes. Just enough transparency to appear inclusive, not enough to grant influence. He mistook my composure for acceptance. But silence, when chosen deliberately, is not passive. It creates space. And in space, people reveal themselves. I shifted my energy away from reacting and toward observing structure. I reviewed corporate bylaws, not casually, but line by line. I requested archived governance documents under the pretense of updating estate planning records. No one questioned it. I had always been the organized one. I scheduled private lunches with 2 long-standing board members, not to accuse, to reminisce, to ask about their retirement timelines, their succession concerns, their risk appetite. Patterns began to surface. Daniel had initiated preliminary conversations about restructuring voting rights in the holding trust, framed as modernization, efficiency, future-proofing. He hadn't told me that. Interesting. He had also accelerated a review of executive compensation models, his own notably. Subtle shifts, nothing criminal, nothing flamboyant, just movement. And the more I said nothing, the more comfortable he became expanding. At home, I built a parallel timeline. Date of first signed power of attorney. Date of initial medical authorization. Board notification sequence. Restructuring proposals. Each piece alone was defensible. Together, they formed intent. The emotional challenge wasn't a strategy. It was a restraint. Every instinct in me wanted to confront him, to say, I see what you're doing. But confrontation would give him something valuable, time to adjust the narrative. Instead, I chose stillness. At dinner one evening, Daniel leaned back in his chair and said casually, "You seem calmer about all this." "I am," I replied. He studied me for a moment as if recalibrating. "You always did hate conflict," he added lightly. I smiled. It wasn't the conflict I hated. It was inefficiency. That night, I visited my father again, this time without informing Daniel first. He seemed clearer than the official report suggested. Tired, yes. Frustrated. "They keep explaining things to me slowly," he said, as if I can't follow. "Can you?" I asked. He met my eyes, sharp, present. Yes, that was enough. Silence became my instrument after that. Not because I was afraid, because I was measuring. Daniel believed power was about occupying the visible center. He stepped into the spotlight eagerly. I stepped back into the architecture. And architecture decides how long a spotlight can stand. When someone believes they've neutralized you, they relax. They stop hiding the mechanics. Daniel had started to move faster. Faster means sloppier. I didn't need to shout to stop him. I needed him to think he had already won. Silence, when strategic, is not absence. It's positioning. And I was almost ready to move. Preparation never looks dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine. After I chose silence, my life appeared unchanged. I went to the office. I attended board-adjacent events. I visited my father regularly. I even began helping Daniel with a regulatory review he claimed was tedious. He welcomed the assistance. That was his first blind spot. Daniel had always viewed compliance as technical maintenance, necessary but secondary to vision. He believed leadership meant steering the ship, not inspecting the hull. So when I asked for access to certain archived subsidiary agreements to double-check exposure, he approved it without hesitation. What he didn't realize was that I wasn't just reviewing exposure. I was mapping authority. Our father's empire wasn't a single entity. It was a layered structure of holding companies, trusts, international subsidiaries, and voting agreements accumulated over 3 decades. Complex enough to discourage scrutiny, elegant enough to reward it. Most of it had been built before Daniel entered the business full-time. I began documenting not just the current governance structure, but the contingencies embedded within it. Clauses triggered by incapacity, thresholds for removing acting authority, requirements for independent medical verification. Some of those clauses required 2 board signatures, some required 3. One required something Daniel had overlooked, a family co-trustee signature, mine. I didn't react immediately when I found it. I didn't sit back in triumph. I reread it 6 times to ensure interpretation accuracy. Under the primary holding trust, drafted 12 years earlier when our father survived a cardiac scare, there was a provision requiring joint signatory oversight if long-term incapacity was declared. Temporary power of attorney could be granted individually. Permanent restructuring authority could not. Daniel had secured temporary control. He was positioning for permanence, but permanence required me. He either hadn't read that far or assumed I would sign. I kept my discovery to myself. In parallel, I scheduled a private consultation, not with a family lawyer, but with an external governance specialist I trusted professionally. I framed the conversation hypothetically. If a primary executive were declared cognitively compromised, I asked, what standards typically govern reassessment? The answer was precise. Independent evaluations, transparent documentation, no conflicts of interest. Conflicts of interest. The neurologist Daniel had used was affiliated with a private advisory network that frequently serviced executive transitions, not illegal, but connected. I began tracing professional overlaps, quietly. Board member A had worked with that clinic's advisory arm on a previous acquisition. Board member B had referred executives there before. The ecosystem was small, interconnected, not a conspiracy, a convenience. The more I mapped, the calmer I became. Meanwhile, Daniel accelerated. He began drafting proposals to consolidate voting shares for stability. He floated the idea of reducing our father's direct board appearances to minimize stress. He spoke often about protecting the legacy. He never noticed that I stopped reacting emotionally to those phrases. Instead, I asked logistical questions. Has the secondary medical review been scheduled? Which compliance body will receive the updated filing? Will minority shareholders be notified before restructuring? Each question seemed procedural, harmless. But questions force documentation. Documentation creates timestamps. Timestamps reveal sequence, and sequence reveals intent. In the evenings, I updated my private file, a timeline now stretched across my dining table. Digital and printed copies cross-referenced. Medical authorizations signed before episodes. Power of attorney dated before board disclosure. Restructuring drafts circulating before official diagnosis confirmation. Not explosive evidence, but pattern. The most important preparation, though, wasn't legal. It was relational. I met quietly with 2 board members separately, men who had known me since I was a teenager. I didn't accuse Daniel. I didn't suggest misconduct. I simply asked, if permanent incapacity were declared, how comfortable would you feel with the current evaluation process? They hesitated, not because they distrusted Daniel, but because no one had examined the process closely. I watched realization bloom slowly, not suspicion, just caution. That was enough. Daniel believed power was something you seize visibly. He never noticed that I was repositioning the ground beneath him. And the most dangerous part? He trusted me. He thought my silence meant loyalty. He thought my assistance meant alignment. He never considered that the quiet daughter he underestimated had grown fluent in structural leverage. He never noticed that I wasn't preparing to confront him. I was preparing to choose. The moment of leverage didn't feel triumphant. It felt quiet. I was alone in my father's study when it crystallized. He had asked me to bring over a few archived documents, old acquisition summaries he wanted to reread. Daniel had begun limiting the volume of paperwork reaching him, allegedly to reduce strain. So I became the bridge. The study still smelled faintly of cedar and ink. Floor-to-ceiling shelves, a desk worn smooth where his forearms had rested for decades, while signing deals that built the empire Daniel now believed he was inheriting. While he napped in the adjoining room, I opened the locked lower drawer of the desk. I knew the code. I'd known it since I was 16. The year he taught me how to access emergency documents in case anything ever happened. Inside were original trust documents, not copies, originals, including the primary holding trust amendment drafted after his cardiac scare 12 years earlier. I laid it flat on the desk and reread the incapacitation clause slowly. Temporary power of attorney permitted for operational continuity. Permanent declaration of mental incapacity requiring 2 independent neurological evaluations, a board-supervised review panel, co-trustee confirmation for structural voting changes. My name appeared in clean, unambiguous ink. Co-trustee. Daniel had focused on the power of attorney. He had focused on optics. He had not accounted for the deeper architecture. I felt no rush of vindication, just alignment. Control over my father meant control over the empire, but permanent control required legitimacy, and legitimacy required me. I understood then that Daniel's strategy depended on acceleration. If he could move from temporary precaution to accepted reality quickly enough, the board would normalize it. Markets would adjust. Minority shareholders would comply. Momentum becomes authority. But momentum collapses under procedural scrutiny. The second part of the reveal came later that week. Through my governance contact, I learned that the neurologist Daniel used had conducted only one evaluation so far, not two. And the documentation filed with the board referenced ongoing assessment, not confirmed permanent incapacity. In other words, Daniel was positioning for permanence without having secured the required structural steps. He was betting no one would slow the process down. I drove home that night through Boston traffic, feeling something unexpected. Sadness, not because I feared losing, but because I finally saw the full distance between us. Daniel wasn't just ambitious. He was afraid that if he waited for organic succession, our father might reconsider the leadership structure, afraid that shared authority might dilute his control, afraid that my competence, long ignored, might eventually be formally recognized. So he accelerated. I didn't feel anger toward him in that moment. I felt clarity about what needed to happen next. There were options. I could confront him privately and demand course correction. I could bring the trust clause directly to the board and initiate a formal procedural review. I could go to our father and explain the structural safeguards he himself had embedded years ago. Each option had consequences. Confrontation would warn Daniel. Public escalation would destabilize markets. Silence would allow him to continue tightening control. I sat at my kitchen table again that night, the trust amendment open beside me. I traced my name with my fingertip, not sentimentally, but analytically. Co-trustee. He had never treated me as such. But legally, structurally, irrevocably, I was. The leverage wasn't explosive. It wasn't scandalous. It was procedural, and that's why it was powerful. The private reveal wasn't about catching Daniel in a crime. It was about understanding that the foundation he was standing on had weight limits, and I held the load-bearing beam. I closed the folder slowly. No celebration, no dramatic phone calls, just one steady realization. The next move I made would be irreversible. There is a moment in every structural conflict where delay becomes complicity. I reached that moment on a Tuesday morning at 6:12 a.m., staring at an email draft I had rewritten 7 times. Daniel had scheduled a special board session for the following week. The stated purpose? Formalizing long-term governance adjustments in light of evolving medical guidance. Long-term. The phrase confirmed what I already knew. He wasn't waiting for a second independent evaluation. He was building consensus first, so that by the time paperwork caught up, the outcome would feel inevitable. Momentum before verification. I had 3 clear options in front of me. Option 1. Call Daniel privately and confront him. Explain the trust clause. Demand procedural compliance. Offer him a path to correct course quietly. The problem with that option was simple. He would adapt. He would slow down just enough to protect himself, frame the shift as collaborative, and still consolidate control, only more carefully this time. Option 2. Go directly to our father and explain everything. The co-trustee requirement, the acceleration, the missing evaluation. But I had to consider something painful. If Daniel had already begun influencing how our father perceived his own capacity, introducing legal complexity might overwhelm him. And if my father hesitated publicly, the board might interpret it as further cognitive decline. Option 3. Trigger the clause. Not emotionally, procedurally. The trust amendment allowed any co-trustee to request immediate independent neurological reassessment if structural changes were proposed under contested capacity conditions. In plain language, I could halt the board session until 2 independent evaluations were completed under neutral supervision. Not accuse, not expose. Pause. A pause, in this context, would do something Daniel hadn't anticipated. It would slow momentum, and when momentum slows, scrutiny increases. I poured coffee and reread the email draft one last time. It was addressed not to Daniel, but to the full board. Subject: procedural clarification regarding incapacity provisions. No emotional language, no allegations, just a citation of the Trust Amendment Clause and a formal request that any long-term governance changes be deferred pending dual independent assessments as required by governing documents. I included the exact page reference, and I copied our father. My finger hovered over send for several seconds, not because I doubted the legality, but because I understood the relational cost. Once sent, I could no longer be the supportive, quiet daughter in the background. I would become visible, not aggressive, not dramatic, but immovable. I pressed send. The email left my outbox at 6:19 a.m. Then I closed my laptop and went for a walk. The air was cold, sharp against my skin. My heartbeat was steady, not racing. That surprised me. I wasn't acting out of anger. I was acting out of alignment. Control over my father meant control over the empire. But control over the empire required legitimacy, and legitimacy requires process. By invoking the clause, I hadn't attacked Daniel. I had forced the structure to operate as written. There was no going back now. If Daniel responded emotionally, he would look unstable. If he resisted procedural review, he would look defensive. If he complied, he would lose speed. For the first time since this began, I felt something unfamiliar. Not relief. Balance. The decision had been made. Quietly. Irreversibly. The board's response arrived faster than I expected. By 9:03 a.m., 3 members had replied, all with variations of the same tone, measured, procedural, slightly cautious. Thank you for flagging the clause, Nora. We'll need to review this before next week's session. Appreciate the clarification. Daniel didn't respond. Not immediately. That silence told me more than anger would have. He hadn't anticipated resistance structured this way. If I had accused him directly, questioned his motives, or implied manipulation, he could have framed me as emotional, protective, even destabilizing. But I hadn't attacked him. I had cited the governing document. And documents don't argue. They require compliance. By midday, the special board session was officially postponed pending procedural review. Postponed. Momentum slowed. I didn't celebrate. Instead, I continued moving. I contacted the governance specialist I trusted and requested a formal recommendation for 2 independent neurologists with no prior advisory ties to our company. Neutral, unconnected, respected. I forwarded those recommendations to the board chair, not Daniel, framing them as assistance to streamline next steps. I also requested that any interim authority Daniel exercised remain strictly operational, with no structural voting modifications until reassessment concluded. Again, not an accusation, a boundary. Daniel called me that evening. His voice was calm, almost curious. That was unnecessary, he said. Was it? I replied evenly. You could have spoken to me first. And what would that have changed? A pause. You're escalating something that didn't need escalation. I'm following the trust language, I said. You know that. Another pause, longer this time. You think I'm doing something unethical? I think procedure protects everyone. I chose each word carefully. If I accused him, he would defend himself. If I moralized, he would counter. If I stayed structural, he had nowhere to push. You've always liked rules, he said quietly. No, I corrected gently. I like stability. He exhaled. What he understood in that moment, though he didn't say it, was that this wasn't a confrontation he could dominate through confidence. It wasn't a room he could charm. It was a framework he had underestimated. Over the next week, independent assessments were scheduled. Not rushed, not secretive, transparent. Board members began asking more detailed questions, not about Daniel's leadership, but about process integrity. When was the first evaluation requested? Who initiated it? Were alternative opinions considered? Nothing explosive, just light. Light changes rooms. Meanwhile, I maintained outward normalcy. I attended meetings. I contributed where appropriate. I never criticized Daniel publicly. In fact, when a junior executive speculated about family tension, I dismissed it. We're aligned on protecting the company, I said calmly. That statement was true. We were aligned on protection, just not in control. Daniel began moving differently, slower, more cautious. I could see it in his posture during meetings, the subtle recalibration. He was no longer accelerating. He was waiting. Waiting meant uncertainty, and uncertainty shifts perception. The board chair requested a private conversation with me 3 days later, not to accuse Daniel, to understand the trust architecture more clearly. The conversation lasted 45 minutes. When it ended, I understood something significant. The consequences had begun. Not dramatic, not public, but structural, and Daniel felt it. He just didn't yet understand how far it would go. The first visible consequence wasn't loud. It was hesitation. At the next executive meeting, Daniel opened as he always did, confident, composed, projecting stability. But there was a subtle shift in the room. Board members who once nodded automatically now asked clarifying questions. Is this contingent on medical reassessment? Should we defer until capacity status is formally confirmed? Not confrontational, just careful. Carefulness slows authority. Daniel answered smoothly, but I could see the recalibration happening in real time. He could no longer reference long-term transition, as if it were inevitable. Every strategic suggestion now carried an invisible asterisk, pending review. Momentum had fractured. I said very little during those meetings. Not because I had nothing to contribute, but because silence now worked in my favor. The structure was speaking for me. Meanwhile, the independent neurological evaluations were conducted under transparent conditions. Different clinic. No advisory ties. Full documentation shared with the board. The preliminary findings came back measured. Age-related fatigue. Stress impact. No definitive evidence of cognitive incapacity. No permanent declaration, which meant Daniel's foundation, built on the assumption of accelerating decline, no longer felt solid. He hadn't fabricated symptoms outright. That would have been reckless. But he had interpreted ambiguity as urgency, and urgency is hard to defend once neutral evaluation enters the room. The second consequence appeared more quietly. 2 minority shareholders requested clarification about governance stability after learning of the postponed restructuring session. The board, now cautious, shared procedural updates transparently. Transparency invites scrutiny. Scrutiny invites recalibration. Daniel's executive compensation proposal, once framed as efficiency-based restructuring, was deferred until post-assessment clarity. Deferred, a small word with a large impact. I never referenced his compensation proposal directly. I didn't need to. The process had done that work. At home, our father seemed lighter. "They're asking me more questions again," he told me one evening. Actual questions. "Do you mind that?" I asked. He shook his head slowly. "No, I mind being spoken for." That sentence settled something deep inside me. Daniel had convinced himself he was protecting our father from pressure. In reality, he had begun replacing him. Replacement, even when disguised as support, carries weight. One night, Daniel stopped by my apartment unexpectedly. He stood in the doorway longer than usual before speaking. "You blindsided me," he said quietly. "I cited a clause," I replied. "You made it look like I was hiding something." "I made it necessary to verify." He looked tired, not defeated, just unsettled. "You could have trusted me." The irony was almost gentle. "Trust requires transparency," I said. He didn't argue. That was the moment I understood the consequences had shifted from structural to psychological. He was no longer certain of the narrative. He couldn't position himself as a heroic caretaker without appearing resistant to neutral review. He couldn't accelerate governance without triggering additional oversight. He wasn't losing power publicly. He was losing inevitability, and inevitability had been his strongest asset. Control over my father meant control over the empire, but control built on acceleration collapses under patience. I didn't feel victorious. I felt steady, because this was never about humiliating Daniel. It was about restoring equilibrium. And equilibrium, once disrupted, doesn't snap back loudly. It settles, slowly. By the time the final independent evaluation was submitted, the narrative had already shifted. Not dramatically, not publicly, but internally, within the board, within shareholder correspondence, within quiet conversations behind closed doors. Certainty had dissolved. The report was clear: no medical basis for declaring permanent mental incapacity. Recommendation: continued monitoring under standard executive wellness protocols. In other words, no structural justification for governance transfer. The board chair called an emergency review session, not to confront Daniel, but to reassess procedural integrity. That distinction mattered. If they had accused him of misconduct, he could have defended himself, framed it as a misunderstanding, claimed protective urgency. But instead, the discussion centered on process failure. Why was the first evaluation conducted before documented cognitive incidents? Why was a permanent restructuring session scheduled without completing dual assessments? Why had the communication to minority shareholders referenced long-term transition prematurely? The tone wasn't angry, it was concerned. Concern is colder than outrage. Daniel attended that meeting composed, but the rhythm of his speech had changed. He was explaining more than asserting. "I acted in good faith," he repeated. No one said he hadn't. That was the most devastating part. They didn't accuse him of bribery. They didn't claim criminal intent. They questioned judgment. Judgment lingers longer than scandal. After the session, the board formally reinstated our father's full executive authority, with a joint advisory structure for oversight, shared. Daniel remained in his operational role, but without expanded voting power. The proposed restructuring was shelved indefinitely. Shelved. Momentum had not only slowed, it had reversed. That evening, Daniel came to our father's house without calling first. I happened to be there. He didn't look angry. He looked cornered. "You let this spiral," he said quietly to me in the study. "I invoked the trust clause," I replied. "You knew what it would do." "Yes." He ran a hand through his hair, something he hadn't done since we were children. "They don't trust me the same way now." I held his gaze. "They trust the structure more." He flinched at that, not outwardly, but internally, because he understood the implication. Trust in structure means less reliance on personality, less reliance on him. Our father entered the room slowly, steady, but dignified. "I never asked to be removed," he said calmly. Daniel's shoulders tightened. "I was protecting you," he replied. "From what?" our father asked. There was no accusation in the question. Only weight. Daniel didn't answer, because the answer was ambition, or fear, or impatience, none of which sounds noble when spoken aloud. In that moment, something irreversible settled into place. even if Daniel apologized, even if he reframed everything as caution. The board had seen acceleration without verification. The shareholders had seen a postponed restructuring. Our father had seen himself managed. You can repair relationships. You cannot unring procedural alarms. Too many documents now existed. Too many timestamps. Too many eyes. Daniel wasn't removed. He wasn't publicly disgraced. But he was no longer inevitable. And inevitability had been the cornerstone of his plan. It was too late to fix that. Not because I destroyed him, but because he revealed himself under scrutiny. Quietly. Completely. The final conversation happened 3 weeks later. Not in a boardroom. Not at our father's house. But in Daniel's office, late in the evening, after most of the staff had left. The city lights reflected against the glass behind him. For years, he had stood in front of that skyline as if it were already his. I sat across from him without my portfolio this time. No documents, no clauses, just us. He didn't offer me a drink, didn't perform courtesy. He simply leaned back and said, "You could have destroyed me." It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation. I didn't want to, I replied. He studied my face carefully, as if searching for irony. "You knew about the clinic connection," he said. "Yes." "You suspected the acceleration." "Yes." "And you didn't bring it to the board as misconduct." "No." Silence stretched between us, not hostile, just exposed. "Why?" he finally asked. "Because I didn't need to." But I didn't say that. Instead, I answered honestly. "Because this was never about proving you corrupt." His jaw tightened slightly. "You think I am? I think you were impatient." That landed harder than any accusation. Impatience implies weakness. He stood and walked toward the window. "I was trying to secure stability," he said quietly. "Markets punish uncertainty. Markets also punish manipulation," I replied evenly. He turned back. "I didn't manipulate anything. You accelerated a medical narrative before it was confirmed." He didn't argue. "That's not illegal," he said after a moment. "No," I agreed, "and it's not." That was the heart of it. He hadn't broken laws. He had bent timing, and timing in governance is everything. "I thought you didn't care about the company," he said. There it was, the assumption that had guided his entire strategy. "I care about the structure," I said. "Structures outlast personalities." He absorbed that in silence. For the first time in our lives, we were not siblings negotiating emotion. We were co-trustees acknowledging reality. "You forced oversight," he said. "I enforced it." He exhaled slowly. "They'll never look at me the same. They'll look at you more carefully." Another silence. Then something unexpected happened. He nodded, not in defeat, in recognition. "You always did play the long game," he said. "No," I corrected gently. "I just read the documents." There was no shouting, no raised voices, no dramatic declarations. Just clarity. We both understood what had shifted. He would remain in leadership, but not unchecked, not inevitable. As I stood to leave, he said quietly, "You could have embarrassed me publicly." I didn't need to. And that was the end of it. Not reconciliation, not rupture. Balance. It's been 18 months since that board session. Our father still holds executive authority, though he delegates more thoughtfully now. Not because he was forced to, but because oversight became normalized. The dual evaluation protocol remains embedded in governance policy, revised with clearer safeguards. Daniel continues to lead operations, but something fundamental changed. Not his title, his posture. He consults more, documents more, moves more deliberately. And when he speaks about transition, he does so with a process already in place. People often ask me quietly if I won. That question tells me they misunderstand the story. This was never a competition for the spotlight. It was a correction of the imbalance. For most of my life, I allowed myself to be positioned as peripheral, not because I lacked competence, but because I believed stability required invisibility. I no longer believe that. Visibility doesn't require volume. Authority doesn't require dominance. What I learned through this wasn't how to defeat someone. It was how to occupy the space I had legally and morally always held. Co-trustee. The word no longer feels symbolic. It feels integrated. Our father and I speak differently now, more directly. He has acknowledged in his own restrained way that he underestimated how much I understood about the architecture he built. "You were listening all those years," he said once, almost amused. "Yes," I replied. "Daniel and I are not adversaries, but we are no longer operating inside unspoken assumptions. He knows I will read every clause. He knows acceleration without verification will be questioned. And I know that his ambition, when tempered by structure, can actually strengthen the company. I don't feel bitterness. That surprises people. They expect resentment, some dramatic fracture. But resentment requires lingering injustice. What happened here was exposure, not of corruption, of imbalance, and an imbalance, once seen clearly, can be corrected without explosion. I still carry the same black leather portfolio, still annotate margins, still prefer measured language over emotional declarations. But I no longer shrink to preserve comfort. If a clause names me, I inhabit it. If a structure includes me, I stand in it. Being underestimated taught me patience. Being dismissed taught me precision. Being nearly excluded taught me presence. I am not louder now. I am simply acknowledged. And that acknowledgement did not come from demanding recognition. It came from aligning myself with the architecture that was already mine. When people hear the beginning of this story, my brother bribed a doctor to declare our father mentally unfit so he could seize power of attorney before I returned. They expect fireworks. They expect exposure, public humiliation, a dramatic fall from grace. But real power shifts rarely look like that. They look like documentation. They look like a restraint. They look like someone choosing structure over spectacle. Control over my father meant control over the empire. But control without legitimacy is fragile. What nearly happened in my family wasn't a crime in the cinematic sense. It was something subtler, a narrative accelerated before it was verified, authority assumed before it was structurally complete. And the lesson wasn't that ambition is evil, it was that ambition without process corrodes trust. If I had reacted emotionally, I would have validated the frame that I was unstable, reactive, and secondary. If I had stayed silent indefinitely, I would have allowed the imbalance to calcify. Instead, I did something simpler. I read the documents. I enforced the clause. I slowed the timeline. Sometimes justice isn't loud. It doesn't humiliate. It doesn't destroy. Sometimes justice is forcing a system to follow its own rules. If you are the quiet one in your family, if you are the person who notices inconsistencies but hesitates to speak because you fear being labeled difficult, ask yourself this. Are you silent because you are powerless? Or are you silent because you are still deciding how to move? There is a difference. And when you finally choose to act, not from ego, not from anger, but from alignment, you may find that you never needed to overpower anyone. You only needed to stand where you were already meant to stand. So I'm curious, if you had been in my position, would you have confronted him directly, or would you have let the structure speak? I'd genuinely like to know.